What do the controversies and tensions within the church under Pope Francis mean for Catholicism and the world? New York Times columnist and author Ross Douthat joins us with analysis, and he'll discuss his new book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. And later, he's appearing now in theaters as St. Luke in Paul, Apostle of Christ. Actor and producer Jim Caviezel joins us to discuss his portrayal of Luke the Evangelist, and he'll get into those rumors of a Passion of the Christ sequel. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. An important show for you tonight. Ross Douthat and Jim Caviezel are straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Before we start, I'm delighted to report that Will Wilder 2, The Lost Staff of Wonders, is now out in paperback. It's the second book in the Will Wilder series. I know a lot of you like paperback editions, and this one comes with an added bonus. Inside is a special preview chapter of Will Wilder 3. You can order the paperback edition of Will Wilder, The Lost Staff of Wonders now. Both books in the Will Wilder series are now available in hardback, paperback, and dynamic audio. Go to willwilderbooks.com, the EWTN Religious Catalog, Amazon, your independent bookseller, anywhere books are sold. Will Wilder 3 is coming soon. Now, here with analysis in New York is New York Times columnist and author of the new book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Ross Douthat, thank you for joining me. I want to get into why you decided it was time to write this book. I know you've been writing in your column about the Pope for years. Why now?
Well, that's as with any book, you started a couple years before it actually came out. So I probably started this sometime after the Second Synod on the Family and around the time that the Pope Francis came out with his document on family, marriage, and so forth, Amoris Laetitia. And it seemed to me at that point that I was in sort of a distinctive position. I'm a conservative-leaning Catholic who writes primarily for a secular audience in the pages of the New York Times. And that gives me, in certain ways, a certain independence, I think, in a way that isn't always true of people who cover the church, who feel, if they're conservative Catholics, they take a certain line. If they're more liberal Catholics, they take another. And my job is to explain what's happening in the church to secular readers. And I found that I was explaining what I think is honestly the most fascinating religious story of our time, which is something that I should say I think you've covered very well on your show. But, the Pope's very real concerted effort to shift Catholic doctrine and Catholic teaching in certain ways around marriage and sexuality, and all of the resistance that summoned up, all of the complexities of Vatican intrigue that, although I'm not a Vatican insider myself, I tried to rely on others to work into this book.
No, you quote liberally from Edward Penton and so many people who've been watching this and covering this so closely. What I love about it, Ross, it's a very sober read. This is not polemical, it's not nasty. I think it gives you an overview of why this matters. And as you say in the book, most Catholics don't even know that there's a controversy going on. They see a happy Pope, he says funny things about tattoos, he kisses babies. What's not to like? You see something more concerning here. What is it?
Well, I think Pope Francis has combined this incredibly impressive sort of public ministry, basically, that, it's not just sort of kissing babies, it goes beyond that. It's embracing men with boils, it's washing feet, it's doing things that really, I think, capture the world's imagination in a way that's very good for the church. But at the same time, I think it's clear that the Pope thinks that Catholicism, especially in the West, has to make a kind of peace with the sexual revolution. And the debate over communion for the divorced and remarried has been sort of the primary place where that battle has been fought. Those attempted reforms have been pushed. But the end result is, at least at the moment, a kind of decentralization of church teaching, where different churches in different dioceses and different countries and so on are being permitted to effectively experiment. And so you're ending up with the church having one teaching on marriage in Germany and a different one in Poland, or in the United States, one teaching effectively in Chicago and another in Philadelphia. And that's, I think it's not something that necessarily affects the everyday life of Catholics in the pews, and there are often good reasons why, it might be bad for your spiritual life to pay too much attention to Vatican politics. But in the scope of Catholic history, to have a pope who is trying to change things that many people think can't be changed and meeting resistance and, making these kind of moves, it's a big story. It's a theological crisis that, whether I'm right or wrong about sort of, whether the Pope is right or wrong, people will be arguing about and thinking about, I think, for hundreds of years. And so we're sort of privileged as Catholic journalists to live in very interesting times for the church.
Oh, no, this is the biggest story. I agree with you. This is the biggest religious story maybe in 30 or 40 years, and maybe since the Second Vatican Council. I'm just amazed at how many people ignore it. I guess it makes people uncomfortable. They don't want to be seen as in any way looking with a sober eye at the Pope. They want to just sort of cheerlead. And I understand that impetus, and as Catholics, you naturally support and love the Pope. But it does beg questions of us as journalists that I don't think you can turn your eye away from. I want to put something up, Ross. This is from your book. And you write about Cardinal Kasper, a man who this audience is certainly familiar with. He was the genesis, really, of this footnote in Amoris Laetitia that allows communion for divorced and remarried Catholics without an annulment under certain circumstances. You write, Cardinal Kasper had fastened on to the one reform that the Church should not contemplate, at least not without falling into self-contradiction and performing an auto-demolition on its own claim of authority. Explain that, and why, in your mind, this is such a dangerous place to be.
Well, it's a place where not only sort of church tradition and past Catholic teaching and, recent papal statements are at stake. It's a place where the Church's teaching goes back to the New Testament and to the very words of Jesus himself. And that's why it's actually different in certain ways from other flashpoints around sexual morality and so on. It's the case that Jesus doesn't say anything about contraception in the Gospels. He doesn't say anything about homosexuality or same-sex marriage. But he does say something very clear and, to his own disciples' ears, very shocking about the indissolubility of marriage. And it's true that the Church has found, in the wake of the sexual revolution, various ways to make accommodations for the kind of chaos and disruption and disorder in which all of us live. And I should say I'm, a child and grandchild of divorce. I'm very intimately familiar with all the difficulties and complexities around these issues. Yeah. But the way the Church has found to make that compromise is to have an annulment process that essentially still tries to respect the idea that a marriage might be an indissoluble reality and that it deserves a kind of defense in the Church's own courts of law. And what Francis has effectively done, sort of ambiguously and, allowing it in places where the local bishop wants to allow it, is something that goes beyond that. And it turns church teaching on marriage into something that's more of sort of a pure abstraction, that notionally the Church has this teaching on indissolubility, but if your marriage fails, you can get an annulment. If you can't get an annulment, there's an easy path back to communion. Right. And I think what that means in the end is a version of what I said in that quote, that, to do that, 25 years after John Paul II taught essentially the opposite, raises profound questions about the nature and consistency of papal authority, which in turn I think is part of why, as you said, a lot of more conservative Catholics understandably don't want to delve too deeply into this. It's easier to just say, well, it's development of doctrine, and so it all has to make sense in the end. And the fact is that it's very hard for me, and I'm a lay Catholic, a journalist, I'm not a theologian, and so I certainly could be wrong, but it's very hard for me to see how you can call this development rather than just a kind of ambiguous reversal.
You see this a rupture? I mean, we keep hearing about the hermeneutic of continuity, that idea that one papacy flows organically into the next,
right,
and there's a continuity here. And there are many who say, look, this is contiguous with everything John Paul and Benedict taught. Do you believe that on the question of marriage?
I mean, no, I think you can obviously see if you read, if not Amoris Laetitia itself, the documents that have been promoted by various bishops and bishops' conferences, if you read them in parallel with statements from the last two pontificates on these questions, I don't think you see development. I think you see divergence. And Amoris Laetitia itself, in its more abstract portions, where it's talking about sort of the moral life writ large,
right,
seems to be in a kind of argumentative dialogue with Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II's famous encyclical on morality. It seems to be written by people who don't agree with what John Paul II said. And look, I mean, the reality is that a great swath of the Catholic intelligentsia believes in a hermeneutic of rupture. They believe that the Second Vatican Council was a more radical change in the life of the Church than John Paul II wanted it to believe, and that therefore we've had this sort of delay under John Paul and Benedict, but now we can sort of move forward. And that isn't the Pope's stated position. It isn't Francis's stated position, but the people he has empowered and the people around him see this as an opportunity to say, yes, the Church, in effect, began again in the early 1960s.
Bishops have told me, and cardinals in Rome, that the spirit of the Second Vatican Council was never fully realized. It is only now, under Pope Francis, that it is seeing its full blossom. Now, my argument back would be John Paul II and Benedict were actual participants in the Second Vatican Council. The people we're talking about now, they were children at the time, if they were alive at all. So it is a curious kind of historical blind spot, I think, that we can wait 50 years until the full realization of something happened, when the people who were there at the creation and even had a hand in drafting some of these documents might not know what the heck they meant in the first place. I mean, that strikes me as bizarre.
I imagine many of those bishops and cardinals saying that to you belong themselves to the generation that came of age, like Francis, just after Vatican II.
Correct.
Because part of what's interesting about this push for change or reform is that it is being carried out by a cohort that sort of came into power in the Church in the 70s and 80s, expected to sort of make a further set of changes, and then were effectively blocked by the last two popes. So it's an odd dynamic where, in many cases, younger figures in the hierarchy, and especially in the clergy, formed under John Paul and Benedict, are more conservative, and it's a sort of older liberals versus younger conservatives dynamic that's very unusual, I think,
it is,
and sort of reverses what you often would expect.
You use the terminology rigged and stage managed to describe that synod on the family. Explain that, and how do you think this upcoming synod on the youth might be following the pattern?
Well, I think rigged is the term of Edward Penton, the very talented Vatican journalist who you mentioned earlier. So it's his term, not mine. I actually prefer stage managed because, rigging implies a kind of illegitimacy, but it's strange, a little strange to talk about illegitimacy when the person doing the stage managing is, of course, the Pope himself, right? So I don't think there's anything necessarily unusual about the fact that Pope Francis worked to sort of push the synods on the family to a particular conclusion. When synods on the family under John Paul and Benedict were, if anything, sort of more controlled. What's distinctive is that, one, Francis did so while officially saying that, this was an open process in a way it hadn't been done to previous popes, and two, that what he was managing toward was an outcome that, again, would sort of shift the Church away from where the last two popes had ended up. But, I mean, the synod on youth, I would imagine that there is, at least to some extent, a similar dynamic. And again, it's not illegitimate. The Pope is the Pope, right? He's the supreme governor of the Church.
Right.
If he wants to hold a synod where the documents are written to aim at particular conclusions and people are selected to drive at particular conclusions, that is completely his right. But it is still the case that there's something odd about the rhetoric of, well, now we're going to listen openly to the youth, and it turns out that the youth are saying just the same things that this older generation of more liberal bishops and cardinals expects them to hear.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the sort of ultimate intention for this synod is precisely, and there may not be one. I don't see something as clear as the Casper proposal on divorce and remarriage. It seems like if there's another big new push around an issue, it's more likely to happen with married priests and the synod that's focused on the Amazon,
right,
where the priest shortage is there. I'm not sure exactly when that's happening, but that's the case where it seems to me there's another particular liberalizing goal. The goal in the youth synod seems a bit more general, as far as I can tell. But you may know better than I.
Well, and I'm not saying yet, Ross. I'm putting something up on the screen. This is from your book. It says the papal message has lost any distinctively conservative element, instead offering simply liberalism in theology and left-wing politics, German theological premises, Argentine economics, and liberal Eurocrat assumptions on borders, nations, and migration. Talk to me a little bit about the way that, and this is a difference in emphasis, and to my mind, our thing is not central to the papacy, but you make the good point. The worldview has shifted here, in that you don't have a man who lived through World War II, and he has a more liberal South American view of the world. How has that changed or will change the church at large? Because these are non-doctrinal perspectives, but nonetheless, it's the Pope saying these things. Right. Turn your air conditioner off, knock the border walls down. He's saying that, and that means something.
And some of that is inevitable, I think, in the sense, and that's a very critical sounding passage you just quoted, and I want to stress that although I am a political conservative in the American context, I don't think there's any doctrinal danger to the church in the Pope, offering criticism of global capitalism, in more pungent terms than his predecessors did, and so on. That, again, is his right as a Pope, and as the church's center of gravity shifts to the global south, which it inevitably will to not just Latin America, but especially Africa, you are going to get from popes, I would imagine, more criticism of the global system and more statements that to us Americans, since we're sort of the center of that system and the most powerful country in the world, that sort of get our backs up a little bit. But I think one of the difficulties with this papacy is that when it started, it seemed to me that, you could imagine that being combined with real sort of moral rigor on issues of marriage and sexuality and so on, that would in effect reassure people that the church, the leaders of the church might seem a bit left-wing on economics, but they were still clearly orthodox.
Right.
And the problem for Francis, it isn't per se that he's, that he takes the side of migrants and so on, though I don't agree with everything that he says about those issues in the European context, but it's that is combined with this sense of sort of, doctrinal drift, which leads then to the sense that many conservative Catholics have, which is why they, or we, I suppose, are conservative Catholics, that there is just this sort of general tug to the left that exists on economics and the environment and inevitably tugs on issues that are actually central to the faith as well.
Ross, I remember before the election, the conclave that elected Pope Francis, the talk in Rome, indeed the rationale for Benedict's retirement, was so that a younger, more reform-minded and capable man could come in and reform the Curia. Do you see that promise of curial reform taking shape under Pope Francis?
I don't think anybody does at this point. I think that, there have been some high-profile firings and there's been some reforming work done in various areas of the Vatican finances. The Pope does give sermons every year sort of criticizing corruption in his own curia. But the structural stuff, the attempt to transform the bureaucracy from something that resembles a Renaissance court into something that can actually function in the 21st century, I don't think that has happened at all. And some of the people sort of charged with doing it, like Cardinal Pell, were blocked in various ways even before he ended up back in Australia facing charges. So no, I think what is true of Francis, and this is also true on sex abuse as well, is that he has a sort of powerful personal charisma, and he can sort of make sweeping gestures. He can, remove some bishops who tolerated or covered up sex abuse, which is something that Benedict, for all his achievements around sex abuse, didn't do. So Francis can make these gestures, but they're very personalized, and they don't translate into big structural reform. And again, even, I think even when I'm among people who are sort of strong admirers of the Pope, they will sort of shrug and joke a little bit about, well, next year, we're going to get that big restructuring done in Rome. Yeah. And we're 5 years in, and it seems unlikely that it will actually happen.
Ross, before we run out of time, and we're almost up against the clock here, I want to share this one last quote from the book. You say, Francis has not just exposed conflicts, he has stoked them, encouraging sweeping ambitions among his allies and apocalyptic fears among his critics. He has not just fostered debate, he has taken sides and hurled invective in a way that has pushed friendly critics into opposition and undercut the quest for the common ground. Your thoughts on where the Church goes from here, and do you see any moderation from the Pope in the way he'll conduct the rest of this papacy?
I don't know his intentions, to be honest, and I try not to speculate too much about sort of, whether he had some comprehensive vision from the beginning, or whether he, sort of took up Walter Casper's proposals and then reacted to conservative opposition. I would say, those of us who are critical of the Pope have to recognize that, we are always in danger of falling a bit into the trap of being the elder brother in the parable of the prodigal son, right? That, you have this Pope who sort of very clearly wants to go out to the peripheries, and we're there concerned about doctrine and maybe, proud of the fact that we've been going to Mass every Sunday and so on. And you have to scrutinize yourself and recognize that temptation. I think on that theme, though, in the parable of the prodigal son, when the elder brother gets his back up, the father does not turn and begin sort of berating him for closed-mindedness and rigidity. And I think just on the rhetorical level, the Holy Father's sort of determination to cast those who are sort of concerned about the integrity of Catholic doctrine as Pharisees and fundamentalists has been a big rhetorical mistake. And it's made it harder than it should be going forward to find common ground. But I'm very uncertain. The book, again, the book is not written in a spirit of certainty about, the Church can't change absolutely, and so Francis must be defeated or something. I think, part of the humility of being a Catholic, daring to criticize the Pope, is to recognize that you could be wrong, and there are a lot of possible scenarios that could work themselves out in the Church as this, as the Francis era's effects are felt over years and decades to come.
And as you point out in the book, rightly, the Pharisees were the ones who were attacking Jesus on the marriage question. It was Jesus who took the more rigid position on divorce and marriage, not the Pharisees, not the doctors of the Church. So it is a curious rhetorical casting there by the Pope.
What Jesus often seems to do when he's attacking legalism that's used as a way to evade the moral law. So he's saying, look, the Pharisees, you have these complicated legal structures that allow people to get divorced, but in the beginning God made them male and female, and you're using your legal acumen to evade moral obligations. And I think that too, is sort of, that is missing in the way that the Pope and many of his allies sort of read New Testament debates into our own equally fraught era.
Well, it's a thought-provoking read, fascinating, to kind of see it all in one place. And the drama that I cover, I cover every act and beat. To see it all put together this way, I thought was very instructive. Ross Douthat, thank you for being here. The book is To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. It's available now in bookstores everywhere and online. Ross, thanks again.
Thank you, Raymond.
Recently, we brought you a special World Over preview of the new film, Paul, Apostle of Christ. The film's out in theaters now, and tonight I go one-on-one with one of its stars. Our friend Jim Caviezel returns to a biblical epic, his first since Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. He's playing the pivotal supporting role of St. Luke the Evangelist. I spoke to him about being back in that genre that defined his career, how he prepared for the role, and I asked him about those rumors of a sequel to The Passion. We sat down together at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Here's my exclusive interview with Jim Caviezel. Jim, I want to start with this, first of all, going back into this biblical era for you.
Yeah.
Was there any hesitation? I mean, after The Passion, this is really the first biblical epic you've done since The Passion.
Well, David Zelan, who did Game Stands Tall with me, this was his project, and initially when he came to me, I hadn't read the script, but he talked to me about it, and my lawyer of 21 years and one of my dear friends was dying of cancer, and he came back with me to Poland. I did a project back there, and we went to Auschwitz, and you could feel the haunted souls go right through you. I went to the very place where Maximilian Kolbe was martyred. We come home, I say goodbye to Frank. He goes straight to the hospital, and he died 2 weeks later. And so I didn't really have the appetite at the time. And two of my friends that worked for me committed suicide. And somewhere in there, in the morning period, I get a phone call from Zelan again and says, "Hey, would you just take a look at the script?" I read it, and instantly, yes, it was, I'll do this. I saw the relationship between Paul and Luke as a mentor in the same way that Frank was a mentor to me. There's a point when someone that close to you, I mean, we'd go in the morning, we go down to the ocean, and things weren't going right in the business, and oftentimes they're not. But I would complain. I'd be, shortly after the Passion, I couldn't get a job, and you can fall into this place of victim, that it isn't fair. And Frank didn't operate from that point of view. He could always steer me in the right direction. If you keep going down this point of anger, eventually it becomes resentment, and you start wearing it, and I was. And he could always redirect me, but it was because of our faith. And forgiveness was a big part of this story, as it was between Frank and I, and how he saw the world. Being a Christian is not easy. In fact, it's a hard path to follow, but he certainly showed me that it's not weakness, it's not passivity, it's being able to look evil straight in the face with love.
And you read that, when you read the script, you saw and felt
that was the germ.
Connection to what was going on in your personal life.
Yes.
What did you learn about that relationship between Paul and Luke? Because let's face it, we know a lot about Paul. We don't know a whole lot about Luke, other than he wrote the gospel.
Right.
There's the 2 Timothy mention where, Paul says, "I'm here alone with Luke." But that's really it. We know he was a doctor. There's only a few details we have. How did you build the character?
Well, Andrew Hyatt wrote a very good, solid script, and at that point, can you take it to the next level? And when he brought James Faulkner in, we met, and he had this velvety voice, like a white Nat King Cole, and I knew we had something special in the chemistry there, and then you could start to.
But you didn't have many days with him before you started shooting. He landed like what, 2 days, 3 days before the shoot?
Yeah, well, we had a few days of talking about it, and talking about the story, and went through it. Most of my stuff comes from personal experience, and I just happened to was trying to take something that was very sad and lonely, and use it for something good. I figured maybe Luke had something like that. He mentions Mary quite a bit in his gospel, in fact, more than any of the other writers. And then there was a hook when he says to Paul, when I'd never seen Christ in person, but the moment I heard you preach, I saw Christ in you. And that was something. And when I think of personally my own industry and how empty it is, you feel the lack, you feel the pain, you see it in others, and maybe you can give a good medicine. And scripturally it was there. The performances in there are very strong, but the words are still stronger.
What role did prayer and your personal faith have in helping you shape this role? Only the second biblical role you've ever done. And was there any hesitation, given how much of your career has been overshadowed by the Passion and your playing of Jesus?
I'll tell you something interesting. Dennis Quaid, when we did Frequency together, he just says, okay, kid, come here. He's really funny. He said, I'm going to give you I know you didn't ask for it, but I'm going to give you some advice as an actor. Never play Superman and never play Jesus. I'll never forget it.
Well, you violated one of the two, maybe Superman's the next.
I did, but I ran into him again at the Cannes Film Festival when The Passion came out. And he says, he saw it, and he just said, listen, that was extraordinary. And, you know, you will always be able to say you did something in this business. You'll always be able to hang your hat on that. And he said he was proud. And so you have to pick the right one, you know? It just opens up. And I don't know how you turn down Mel Gibson. I mean, the movie he did prior to that was Braveheart, and that wasn't too bad of a film.
Yeah, I noticed that.
You know, so I would work with that guy any day. He's extraordinary. He's the greatest.
There was no hesitation then, going back to this biblical territory.
To this one?
To this one. And the comparisons people might make between
sure it is, but
that performance and this one.
Well, okay, so someone said that recently. They said, well, I saw Jesus in you. I said, thank you. I said, isn't that what it's supposed to be, that I saw Christ in you? And that's what he saw when he saw Paul. And that was my prayer for, I don't know James's. You asked me about
James Faulkner earlier, yeah, but who plays Paul?
But as far as faith-wise, I prayed all the time for him. I prayed for our crew, because the Holy Spirit can work the way it's going to work, but I don't want to block that. I don't want to block it myself. But I also pray for the others that allow that to come through them. And I remember someone said that Faulkner said that
St. Paul played him. He didn't play St. Paul, which sounded an awful lot like something you told me back 10 years ago during the Passion.
But I'm glad that happened. I don't care. Someone said one time, so much would get done and no one cared who got the credit.
Yeah.
I'm glad that he said that. And you can see that in the movie. I mean, you know, you go through this business and you ask any actor that had that one role that you had, that everybody remembers you by. So much of the time, most actors never get that opportunity. I was very, very blessed. I didn't know all the extracurricular activity was going to go on prior, during and after
the Passion, yeah.
But that, again, comes back to Frank Stewart and says, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to be a victim?
No, there were moments here that I saw a lot of, not only your connection to Frank, but, you know, I thought of that idea of writing it down when Paul tells Luke, write this down.
Yeah.
Take this down.
And we added that in there.
Really?
Yes.
That was a improv?
Write it down. Yes.
Really?
Write it down.
Huh.
Yep.
Because that really is what it's about.
Yeah, it
you
is.
have to take that example of that other party and move with them, take their spirit and move forward, particularly if you're leading a community or a business or whatever. But there is that notion that people want to know what that person said.
Yeah.
And I know that. As Mother Angelica's biographer, I kept thinking when I heard that moment, because many times I would go visit her and she would tell me, full story,
right.
Full story, even when she couldn't speak anymore.
Right.
She wanted that full story captured. The thing that struck me was the relationship between Luke and Paul, but that message of mentorship, what it means to be a mentor, and then the responsibility of the one that follows. Taking not only the example, but making sure you capture the words of that individual. Any lesson there for you? Anything
You and I talked about this before. when Mother Angelica died, when Pope John Paul died,
Yeah.
Billy Graham just died,
Right.
and the guard is changing now, and now it's, you know, young man, you have to step up. You're the guy now. Hard, you know, great sadness, but we have to believe that that if we do believe in salvation, they're in heaven, and they're not gone. They're actually greater now than ever before. We carry them with them in our heart. So, as Paul says in the film and in the good book, you know, to live is Christ, to die is gain. And so, you know, come hell or high water, I'm going to hold on to that. I talked a lot to him while I was filming, you know. I talked a lot to my wife, lost her brother this year as well, and her father. It's just been one after the other, but there's a family that is in heaven, but I dare say that they're not with us. I feel them, and I pray that God uses them, and that they're praying for our work down here. And I certainly felt that haunting feeling at times that I felt when I was at Auschwitz with Maximilian Kolbe, that, you know, people often are afraid to die, but we're all going to die at some point.
The movie does capture the terror of this community and the high cost of believing what they believe.
Yeah.
Because they're not just giving lip service to it. They have to live, they're living in fear and hiding out, sending children out into the town to pass messages or to receive things. This goes on today in places like China, in parts of the Middle East, and it's dedicated to those people.
I think, though, what in all of that is, you know, our Lord doesn't spare His closest friends from undergoing suffering, but what I can tell you from the Passion, when I was up there on that cross, and I was freezing, and I had a shoulder separation, and I had hypothermia and lung infection, pneumonia, and I was on all kinds of medications. I felt something so powerful. My heart was burning, and I miss it. I felt heaven in my heart, even as bad as in a situation as that was. Look, after the movie was over, I had to have open heart surgery. And being struck by lightning was, you know, but I never felt abandoned. I felt like He was there with me. And I want people to know that, even in this suffering, that our Lord isn't going to abandon them. He's very, very real. No. But we need that, though, in order to be authentic.
And that's a big part of this film.
And it's yes.
Talk for a moment. I mean, you just went through all the things that happened to you on the set of The Passion. I was there for some of that. Why, given all of that, would you willfully embrace going back to play that role again? I know you've talked about doing the resurrection.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, I see you talking about doing the sequel with Mel again. There's been a lot of reportage about it. Any hesitation?
No, not at all. It's what I was born to do. I felt it 5 years ago. I have no control over this industry or wherever it wants to go. You know, I know Jesus is a good guy, and He's a God, and I love Him. I love His mother, His father. I love the whole heaven, you know, and I want to do everything I can to bring as many souls to heaven. I want them to be home, and that's who He is to me. He's home. And when I was doing The Passion, I was alone. But it was nothing like what he feels on a day-to-day basis. I felt God's love for us. But when I said, I want you to come closer so that the world will see you and not me. And he says, and this is in my dreams now, if I do, you might not like what you get. I said, if it's not authentically you, then the world, will see me in the film. I want them to see you. When he came close to me, I could feel his brokenness, a broken-hearted world. And Billy Graham would say, God loves you. But if I had a message to give, I would say, we need to love God. We need to every day say, I love you, Lord. He needs to hear it from us. In the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, because so many of his children do not love him and have forgotten him. And that's not good enough. And when you ask me, would you do this? Yes, absolutely. I'd do the resurrection again, just for that purpose, so the world will know who he is. I will have served my purpose. It doesn't matter if it costs me my life. I'm okay with that. I freely give it, as long as because in the next moment that I'm in heaven, we talk about that in the film. It'll hurt for a bit. It's gone. You're in heaven. The film goes into that, and then they start our Father, and
With those in prison, you prayed with all of them in prison.
as they're going to be sent off to
Into the circus
into
maxims.
the lions.
Yeah.
And someone said to me a long time ago, Jim, I said, I'm the wrong guy for the role of Jesus. And he goes, Jim, his name's Yvonne. He said, God doesn't always choose the best. But he chose you. What are you going to do? So there's a purpose for all of us.
Tell me what you learned from playing Luke that you didn't expect. He's very different from you. I mean, I know you did the surgeries on the weekend to learn how to
Yeah, I
get
didn't walk
into
on
character.
water for this one.
You didn't have to walk on water,
No.
but just a few brain surgeries. It was good of you to try that out.
He's a pagan. He probably had it made in the shade. He probably had a lot of money.
Man of means.
He was important. Probably liked the women, and he could be with whatever he wants. There's no judgment on it, and you're going to leave all of that and go to a life of persecution.
Living in the shadows, yeah.
You see it in my industry. Go to parties, you see people that just are empty. It's not appealing to me. And some people would rather go after the things and then get nothing here. This is having meaning in your life is everything. So being able to have Jesus come through me in the resurrection or the passion or whatever, even the apostle of Christ, that heaven can use me and to bring people back. What more could you ask for?
What do you want people to come away with after seeing this picture? It is a very intimate movie in many
Correct.
ways.
Yeah.
It's really about the relationship between these two men in the belly of this persecution, and the words, ideas, and story of one of them about to disappear from the face of the earth, and the other guy struggling to preserve it and embody it.
I talked about earlier forgiveness, courage. That courage is ardent love. Love creates change by igniting a passion in each one of us, one person at a time. Paul is the spark that ignites that revolution.
And what do people need to take away from that today? Why now? And why did you have to be a part of it?
Well, I played as Jesus, who's the Son of Man, Son of God. But here's a man who was a like the head of ISIS, a beast, and he has a massive conversion. It can happen to anybody. They're open to grace. We've got a lot of people living in the world right now, and there's not a lot of time that we're going to be on this earth if you really think about it. Conversion takes a while. It wasn't overnight that Paul was converted, but I believe he probably saw the face of Stephen, who looked up to Jesus and says, I see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of at the Father, coming in the clouds of heaven, repeating what our Lord had said. And the look in his eyes probably haunted Saul by just one little change of a letter from Saul to Paul. Saul means great one, Paul means little one. In order for us to be great in the eyes of God, we have to become very small if we wish to be great. There's this piece in the film where it's like you're out on a boat, and now Paul is talking to Olivier Martinez. He plays the Roman soldier, and that's my favorite scene in the film, because it's like both of them are speaking from a personal experience, and no acting is going on here. So Paul says he reaches out into the water, and he pulls up. He tries to pull the water up, and it just seeps through his hands, and that's kind of like us wanting the world, and all the things that are promises. But there's such a short time when you're giving all of that up. You're giving when you look out and see the sea, and beyond what you can see, God's offering this to you. That's what He, at least, has used me to help bring to others. And I hope in some way I could answer your question, but I think that was the one reason that kept me in the game to want to do these films. But the films still have to be great. And so much of the time that I see these faith-based films, that they're so full of saccharin. I mean, I can't handle that much sugar in my coffee. And there's no bitterness. You know, everybody flips out if some guy uses a swear word, or, you know, what do you want me to do on, you know, Private Ryan? You know, guys are getting blown up and whatnot. You know, you want me to say, get your rootin' tootin' butts up here or something?
It's not reality.
No.
Given your understanding of where we are in the world today, how important this message is to be conveyed now, why wouldn't you play Paul? Why Luke? Luke's a supporting character here.
I'm just helping, being an executive producer and getting it made so people can see it. I'm just the mouthpiece for Paul, I guess. In fact, it's kind of like.
But no temptations on your part to play Paul.
No, not in this one.
No.
No, I just
Why
wanted.
not?
Because I knew I was going to be doing the resurrection, and the possibility of that happening at the time I knew that was in the works, and I loved this story. I thought that the message, there are only so many scripts that are really good, okay, whether it be an action film, a comedy, and my common denominator has always been redemption of some sort, that we can be redeemed. It doesn't mean that I'm going to play the good guy in the movie, but I knew it would help get it made, but I got that. I played Jesus, and I thought that maybe that this guy Faulkner was just born to do it, and I thought that I don't think I could have done it as well as what he did. So I would rather step back and, you know, I guess play Aaron instead of Moses, you know.
Yeah. Any supernatural happenings around the edges as you saw in The Passion? Lives changed in the cast and crew, or did you see any of that?
I'm sure I'll remember more later. I think, to me, is that these movies are really hard to do, and you pray that they're really good, and this one's really good. And the miracle really is what's going to come when people see it and convert. I'll give you one. I was with a friend of mine who sat down and watched the movie, and it doesn't have any belief in God, didn't come from any of that. And he watched the movie, and he turned to me after it was over, and he said, wow, the writer, what's his name? Andrew Hyatt? He goes, yeah, wow, he's a brilliant philosopher. I said, why? Why do you say that? And he started quoting Paul, and I said, yeah, that's in the Bible, dude. And so a couple of days later, he called me up and said, yeah, I might want to see the Passion of the Christ. I said, oh, go get your. He says, I said I might want to see the Passion of the Christ. So there's a work in progress, but a seed was planted. You know, that's the power what these things can do, you know.
I, Luke, send a message to all those that follow our Lord Jesus Christ. There is a terrible evil in the world. Darkness is spreading. I know you are suffering persecution. Faith is being tested. I know you question the way, but I've come to Rome to find Paul, to write his story, to bring hope, to bring light into this present darkness, and to remind us all how God changed a hateful man who will change the history of the world.
Luke, am I dreaming?
I'm here. Rome is stained with the blood of our brothers and sisters.
No! This is what trusting God gets you.
People are desperate. We're the only light left in the city.
I cannot fix their faith.
You can inspire their faith.
You risk people looking to me before Christ.
The day I heard you preach, my God, I saw Christ in you. There are men, women, children that will never meet you. There must be a handwritten account of your acts.
What do you really know about these Christians? I am concerned with these documents.
We've got to get these out of Rome.
Do you think that we are plotting an escape?
Write another word and I send you to whatever God you want.
Luke!
They've gathered men to overthrow Rome.
To what end?
Justice!
They want revenge.
No!
Why not?
Love is the only way. When the moment comes, you will have the strength to do what is right.
Your people die today.
This world doesn't know a thing about love.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
That is all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Will Wilder 2 is out in paperback now. Go get a copy for the little boy and girl in your life. And be sure to set your DVRs. Don't miss a moment of next week's show. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.